Hello, good evening. Welcome to the second webinar of 2023. I'm Sean, the current president of the Oxford and Cambridge Society, Malaysia. I'm sure that I'm not the only one whose mind has been preoccupied with and possibly life has been impacted by the state of the economy, especially over the last year or so. Joining us tonight is our guest, Emeritus Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram, along with our moderators, Alan Ng and Faisal Arif. I'm hoping that some of my questions will be answered tonight. And over to you, Faisal.
Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Oxford and Cambridge Society Talks. Today, we are very, very pleased to have Jomo Kwame Sundaram, who is Emeritus Professor at University of Malaya. He was a founding chair of IDEAS, UN Secretary General for Economic Development and in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and Honorary Research Coordinator for the G24 Intergovernmental Group on International Monetary Affairs and Development from 2005, and then Assistant Director General for Economic and Social Development, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. In 2007, he was awarded, I'm going to mispronounce this, the Wassily Leontiev Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. He has authored and edited over 100 books and translated 10 volumes, besides writing many academic papers and media articles. He has taught in Malaysia since 1974 and at Harvard, Yale, and Cornell. He has also been a visiting fellow at Cambridge University and the National University of Singapore. He studied at the Penang Free School, Royal Military College, Yale, and Harvard. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Jomo. What we're going to do is we're going to split the questions up. Alan's going to handle all the big brain stuff, and then I'll follow up with the not so big brain questions. So Alan, please kick things off.
Thanks, Faisal. And just to add, Professor Jomo is a very prolific writer, and you can actually read his writing at his Substack, My Development, at jomoks.substack. So, Professor Jomo, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to speak here. Then I'll just go straight to the line of questions. You delivered a really powerful and cutting speech last month at the INTI International University. And for listeners tuning in, I highly advise you to read the speech. Again, available on Professor Jomo's Substack. Now, in the speech, you mentioned that Malaysia are now on a metaphorical Titanic, approaching dangerous icebergs. Could you elaborate on what you mean exactly by that?
Thank you very much, Alan and Faisal, and thank you very much for inviting me to join you this evening. The metaphorical icebergs ahead, it's not one iceberg, but several icebergs, international as well as national. We have a very precarious situation where this country, unfortunately, is very divided. And this government, although the Prime Minister enjoys about 2/3 support according to the polls, the ruling coalition probably has a razor-thin majority. Certainly, that's the case as far as its hold in many states in the peninsula. We now have a situation where we have a great deal of pressure, particularly from the main political opposition to the ruling coalition, to engage in mobilizing ethnopopulism. To be sure, Malaysia has long been a leader in terms of ethnopopulism, but this has been given a great deal of legitimacy by people such as Donald Trump, Narendra Modi, and a great number of others. And so it's now very much part of the world in which we live in. But it's a very, very dangerous world in which we live. Then we also have a range of economic problems. One can go through in some detail some of the economic problems, but I would like to highlight two problems. One, we have a situation where at the world level, we have major policy makers, particularly in the West, introducing policies which are likely to slow down the world economy and arguably cause a major stagnation. At another level, we also have the serious likelihood of war. And we are talking really not about war at the level of a small country, one small country getting into a war with another small country. In fact, I think many of us are relieved that, for example, Iran and Saudi Arabia recently resolved some of the problems which have been long-standing for more than 4 decades. But nonetheless, we have a real likelihood of war breaking out because of a number of is arguably provocative actions undertaken by Western countries, and a lot of this is justified in terms of containing China and the threat which China poses ostensibly to freedom in the world. Now, without getting into the details of that, the effect of this has been to legitimize and to popularize the use of economic sanctions. These sanctions are not just in the area of trade, but also investment, finance, and technology. And the result of this is likely to not only slow down economic growth and development, slow down the likelihood of technology transfers and of the acceleration of development, particularly in developing countries, but also one of the likely possibilities is that many smaller countries will be forced to choose. And this is why I think it is very important for us to re-invoke a principle which was introduced in ASEAN half a century ago, namely the idea of creating a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality in Southeast Asia. This is now more relevant than ever, but it's easier said than done. And one needs to work actively to try to ensure this. If we look, for example, at our major trading partners, of course, Malaysia's major trading partner happens to be Singapore, but we all know that that is a statistical issue. Following that, China is the second largest trading partner, and the third largest trading partner is the United States. So we cannot afford to take sides in what is clearly emerging as a new Cold War. And even people who are relative so-called doves on Ukraine, they basically want to get the West, and particularly the United States, not to waste their time fighting with Russia in Ukraine, but to focus their energies on isolating China. But as we also know, China has been the main engine of growth, particularly during the last decade. So we are basically cutting off our nose to spite our face if we go with this kind of logic. So this is a very, very dangerous situation. It's an unprecedented situation, and hence why I'm extremely concerned and why we need good leadership more than ever. Now, in that speech you referred to, I had previously, to give some background, about 7 or 8 months ago, I had gone to see Tun Mahathir and basically urged him to take on the role of an elder statesman for the developing world, rather than to continue to be involved in Malaysian politics. Of course, as usual, he rejected my advice, and we know the consequences thereof. Let me stop there.
All right, thank you so much, Prof. I think Faisal has a lot of questions to you in relation to some of the latter part of what you mentioned about your advice to NAM and so on. But I just want to actually just maybe focus a bit more on your point in relation to China. Now, in various platforms and forums, you have spoken quite a bit about the impact of the Western countries, especially from the US when it comes to some of the sanctions that have implemented, as well as the Federal Reserve decision to increase interest rate very rapidly and so on, how that actually has an adverse impact on the rest of us. But I'm just wondering, what is your view on China? From my readings of your work, you haven't really spoken a lot about China. So I'm just curious about your view on China in terms of the politics, the economics, and also what would you advise our policymakers when it comes to our economic relation with China?
Well, I think China, of course, is not. There's no one China. China is a multifaceted nation. It's a subcontinental nation for all intents and purposes. And for all intents and purposes, let's face it, much of the economy is organized on a capitalist basis. And there are, of course, a great number of small producers, farmers, and others. But we have very relatively little to do with them, at least as far as the outside world is concerned. They are extremely important in ensuring, for example, food security for China and so on and so forth. So it's very important for us to think about China as a relatively rapidly industrializing country. It continues to rapidly industrialize, and it has had very high growth rates for an incredibly extended period of time. And perhaps the only other country which comes close to that, of course, is Vietnam. But in an earlier period, one could talk about Korean growth rates being quite rapid. Now, where does this growth come from? I do not subscribe to the view that the question is essentially that of property rights. It is private enterprise which has ensured what China is today. I think it's a very interesting combination of various types of enterprise forms. If we think, for example, about the last couple of decades of the 20th century, there emerged a phenomenon which was called the TVEs, the Township and Village Enterprises. And these TVEs were extremely important in terms of the initial industrialization of China. Much of it started off with processing many of the products, farm products, and so on. Initially for the domestic market, but increasingly for international markets. Let us not forget that Malaysia continued to trade with China even when it did not recognize the People's Republic after 1949. And so part of the reason Malaysia was able to keep food costs down was precisely because of importation of food from China and so on. And then Tun Razak's visit to China in 1974, a couple of years after Nixon's breakthrough or Kissinger's breakthrough with China, was extremely important, of course, in developing and deepening trade relations with China. Now, it's important also to remember that after the end of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, the world was in chaos. The international monetary system was in chaos, and it was left to countries to find new ways of trying to cope with this new situation. So Malaysia, for example, indulged in what was, in my view, wrongly called barter trade, but all arrangements with initially with India, then with the Soviet Union, later with Pakistan, and then with China, to sell them palm oil on a preferential basis, and to in turn import goods from China. Now, this was very important, and basically this accelerated the transition from rubber to palm oil, and very, very importantly, accelerated the processing of palm oil. So the most important success story as far as industrialization of Malaysia is concerned, precisely because it was done by Malaysian engineers, was the processing of, and especially the refining of palm oil. This has been studied by colleagues, very well studied, and I think this is an incredible story. But there are perhaps not so spectacular stories, for example, as far as the development of crumb rubber. But the development of crumb rubber, of course, took place after the rubber boom was pretty much over as far as Malaysia is concerned. Now, as far as as a trading partner, China has been extremely important and has become even more important in the recent period. And we are now, especially in the period which was called the period of globalization, beginning from the 1980s, we found new types of so-called supply chains, or some people call them value chains, developed. And these supply chains were extremely important and involved many countries in Southeast Asia, including Malaysia. So we all benefited. And so when actions are taken against China, it also hurts others in Southeast Asia because we are part of those very supply chains. China does not have all that many raw materials, perhaps more than Japan, but certainly it doesn't have raw materials of its own. It depends heavily on imported raw materials from Southeast Asia and other parts of the world, including Africa and even Latin America. And so the implications of attacking China from an economic point of view are huge for the developing world because of these supply chains which were developed during the period of globalization. So for me, it is not all that surprising when Xi Jinping says with a completely straight face that he is a great defender of globalization. Now, for some critics of globalization, they don't particularly care for globalization, or they find globalization to be much more problematic. And I think some of the criticisms are still relevant and fair. And we should recognize that while trade globalization has been massively disrupted, and other elements of globalization, finance, technology, and even investments have been disrupted, the disruptions have been very uneven. If we look at, for example, Trump's measures, which have been continued by Biden, or if we look at some of the other measures which have been introduced by the West, these measures have really affected trade perhaps more than anything else, and trade and technology. So rather than, for example, finance. But what we have seen is that the measures which have been taken against, say, Russia and Venezuela and many other developing countries, as far as finance is concerned, has forced more and more developing countries to begin to reconsider their options. And they are now beginning to think of, perhaps we shouldn't be so heavily reliant on using the US dollar. Maybe we should think about other options. So it is very possible that we will have a variety of international monetary systems rather than the dollar anchored system which we have had since the end of Second World War, and even after the end of the Bretton Woods system from 1971.
Yeah, so it's interesting how China. Sorry, Faisal.
Yeah,
go ahead,
Faisal. Just ask a quick question for Prof. Jomo. I just want to push you a bit on that question of neutrality. Is it even an option for Malaysia? Because if you look at the number of colonizers we had the Portuguese, we have the Dutch, we've had the British, we've had the Japanese. And I think a lot of that is due to the fact that 1/3 of the world shipping traffic goes through the Straits of Malacca. In the scenario of a war breaking out, is it really realistic for us to sort of like maintain our neutrality, or will they come for us anyway? And if it's really a choice between being colonized or choosing a side between the Americans and the Chinese, economically, which one makes more sense for Malaysia? I think that's what I'm trying to get at.
I would insist on non-alignment. In other words, not taking sides. Okay, I think that the conditions for the birth of the non-aligned movement in 1961 are very different today. But I think there is still a very strong case for non-alignment in a very different world, because we still have some people would say a bipolar world or a multipolar world. And in fact, unlike the original Cold War, where we had relatively few economic relations with the Soviet Union, with Comecon, and so on and so forth. Today, in fact, China is a more significant trading partner than the United States. Now, or for that matter, Australia and so on and so forth. But if the reason why there is a strong case to be made for neutrality is precisely because we have so much going through the straits, as you correctly point out, and it's precisely for that reason that there will be powers which which will seek to control this region. Now, we don't have the Djibouti option. Just for the information of listeners, Djibouti basically houses military bases of many different countries, including the United States and China. Okay, I think that's an option which we really don't have. Now, I think given the precedent, half a century ago, when ASEAN was created, of course, in '67, but in 1973, exactly half a century ago, the founding fathers declared ZOPFAN, Zone of Peace, Freedom, and Neutrality, and that, it seems to me, has greater relevance now than even before. But we have to be very serious about it, and we find that unfortunately, members of ASEAN have not been taking that commitment very seriously. Yeah. I mean, as we all know, recently President Marcos Jr. of Philippines extended 4 extra military bases in northern Luzon to the United States, in addition to the other 6 bases which it already has. That can hardly be considered neutrality. At the same time, China must do much more to resolve its bilateral issues with the Philippines, with Malaysia, with Vietnam, and so on and so forth. There's no doubt these problems need to be resolved, but then they shouldn't be resolved on the basis of gunboat diplomacy. And this is the objection which I have. So I think we have to be serious. Unfortunately, not all countries in the region have been serious about ZOPFAN, including those who were signatories to ZOPFAN half a century ago.
Thanks, Prof.
So
back to you, Alan.
So if I could go back to the point on China, actually, it's interesting how China is now trying to emphasize South-South cooperation with their new global development initiative and so on. So I'm just wondering, what do you worry about China, Professor, going forward, the outlook for China, given the containment of the rest of the world against China, as well as some of the structural problems that China is facing, like aging and so
on? I'm not advocating for one moment that we fully embrace China and we go into the Chinese camp. Okay, let me be very clear about this. When I say non-alignment, I mean non-alignment. To push the point even further, I would favor a pacifist non-alignment. In other words, that we actively take measures to reduce the number of military bases, to, for example, prohibit nuclear weapons and nuclear-powered vessels from passing through the straits and so on and so forth. There are all kinds of well-established dangers of doing so and allowing that to continue. To be sure, it's already happening, and we have to be very, very strict about it. We have to be very serious about it. But we need cooperation. We need cooperation, especially from Indonesia, but also from Singapore and others, if this is to be the case. Now, if others try to bypass it, for example, by opening up a canal at the Isthmus of Kra and bypassing Southeast Asia as far as shipping is concerned, I'm not that terribly worried, because we are not as dependent on the traffic going through this region as, say, Singapore is. Okay, and so it's not as if it's going to be a mortal blow for us. Just as, for example, when Bangkok tried to challenge Singapore as the regional hub, it had a real fighting chance of doing so during the Chachai Chunavan government in the early 1990s. But that moment has passed, and Singapore is clearly the strong hub. But a time will come when people will be asking themselves, why should we fly an additional 1 point something, almost 2 hours to the south to Singapore, just to go east-west? People will be asking that question, and people will be looking at options involving Bangkok or some similarly located. Now, we have a possibility of becoming a significant hub, not necessarily by challenging Singapore or Bangkok, but we can become a regional hub, and this is why the recent plan to have a regional hub in Subang Airport. We may well end up cutting our nose to spite our face. That's something which we shouldn't be. We should be thinking about. If we want, for example, Indonesians to come to Malaysia and use Malaysia as their main airport. After all, Indonesians use Singapore as their financial center. The financial center of Indonesia is not in Indonesia; it's in Singapore. Likewise, there's no reason why the international hub for travel, air travel, particularly for non-elite passengers, let me put it that way, shouldn't be here in Malaysia. So I think there are important opportunities which we should be thinking about. Another possibility, of course, which we have been talking about but not really doing very much about, is the development of the airport, the KLIA, as a major airport for certain types of goods. It can, and there was the possibility when for example, during the last PH government, when Tun Mahathir was in conversation with Jack Ma about developing Alibaba hub here, but I don't see why it should be exclusively with Alibaba. If you think about Houston or other such hubs for goods, they rarely only work for one company. You basically want it to be available to other companies, and that's the most effective way of emerging as a hub.
All right. Faisal is having some technical problems, so he tried to dial back in. Prof, maybe I just go back to the global problems again. I think you said it before that we are now collectively in the world, we are like sleepwalking into a depression, right? I think you mentioned briefly about that just now as well. And you have always been quite vocal on how the global financials and economic governance in the world need reforming. But in your view, how can we collectively, globally do better? What needs to change? And then as a follow-up to that, what can us, Malaysia, do? Right? I mean, in many ways, the politicians are turning more insular and parochial, and we are really not that influential even within the ASEAN region from a geopolitical perspective, right? So, curious about your thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's a $64 million question, Alan. I mean, and you with your central banking experience and your experience in Securities Commission and so on are probably better placed to think through some of these issues. But sometimes when you see too much of the trees, it's difficult to see the forest. And I have this slightly exaggerated reputation as having predicted the Asian financial crisis. Actually, I did no such thing. I warned that there were certain dangers, and of course, it was impossible to predict the crisis and the timing of the crisis and so on. I just warned of certain things, and unfortunately, the Asian financial crisis happened. And based on that exaggerated reputation, when I was working in the UN, I also warned about a global financial crisis. Again, learning from others. I was watching what people like Dean Baker and Robert Shiller were saying about the US housing bubble and so on. And it became very obvious. But what the difference for me was that I was looking at it internationally, unlike them. So for me, I was interested in the collateralized debt obligations and the whole range of new financial instruments which had developed during that period, which made many more countries vulnerable. So when I approached the World Bank chief economist at that time, and I said, sorry, not the World Bank, the IMF chief economist at that time, and I warned him. He said, no, it's just going to happen in the retail market, retail mortgage market, and perhaps it will spread to the jumbo mortgage market, but it won't go beyond that. And I said, come on, Simon, it's gone. The obligations are far more extensive. And this is where I think the interface between law and economics becomes so important for us to begin to understand. I mean, the work of people like Katarina Pistor at Columbia and so on, where, she shows how, you basically create new types of instruments, how you create new types of property rights, contractual rights, and so on, which have huge implications. So, you can't keep on predicting future vulnerabilities on the basis of past vulnerabilities, because the world is changing, the financial system is changing. And so I think it is people like yourself who have your finger on the pulse of the financial system. But there needs to be a mechanism by which people need to begin to talk to one another. And this is unfortunate. We have, for example, the fiscal authorities hardly ever talk to the monetary authorities. The monetary authorities hardly talk to the people, for example, in capital markets and so on and so forth. So we have a system of some regulation, but the regulation is segmented, and so it does not add up to, just because you have a bit of regulation here, a bit of regulation there, it doesn't end up to a very secure system, because the regulation itself does not recognize the incoherence of its own protective mechanisms. So we really need to be able to think through some of these issues. And one of the problems which we have in Malaysia is that we often look to the West and try to emulate the West as far as so-called best practices are concerned, and we rarely look to what is happening around us. For example, during the pandemic, both the Philippines and Indonesia either suspended or changed their law to enable monetary financing of government debt. This is a big step forward. In other words, you're borrowing from the central bank without going to markets, and this is a very, very important step. And it has been the US, of course, doesn't have such constraints because of its exorbitant privilege. But even Japan, for example, has borrowed so much more than countries like Malaysia, but is able to do so precisely because the debt is kept internal. Now, how do we innovate within our context? And that's why our local Malaysian advocates of MMT, modern monetary theory, they unfortunately don't recognize that the options which are available to the US are not available to countries like Malaysia, for a variety of reasons. The fact that we, and so recommending the same types of policies without paying attention to context becomes inappropriate and unfortunately not very helpful in dealing. So we really need far more coherent recognition of what people call fragility, vulnerabilities, and so on and so forth. And this is where I think we need a far more coherent macroeconomic understanding. And of course, the fact that we are essentially an open economy again imposes all kinds of limitations on what we can do. So it's a very huge challenge, but I don't see policy making having been significantly improved over my lifetime as an economist.
Oh dear. So maybe you can take a pause here for Faisal. Prof, we have more than 500 audience tuning in, and there have been a lot of questions. So I'm wondering, Faisal, whether we should pick some of the questions for Prof now, given that actually some of them touches some of the points that he raised. What do you think, Faisal?
Great idea. Why don't you pick one, Alan?
Sorry, Faisal, we can't really hear you.
Oh dear, does this not work?
So I'll pick one, Prof. So Mark Disney. So he asked, can the Malaysian economy change and grow without the political system changing first?
I don't think this is a Gorbachev type question, you know. I mean, you know, or a Deng Xiaoping type question, you know, that one must come before the other. It, it you know, we have very well-run economies under very authoritarian systems. Not that I'm recommending it for one moment. And we have, the converse. You know, you can have very despotic systems with very poorly run economies. So it doesn't go together, right? But so I think what we really need to do is, insofar as we have pretenses amongst some of us, at least, of being so-called technocrats. Okay, we'd like to think that we can do something to mitigate the challenges which we face, and so I do think that it is important to advocate for that. But you see, the challenge which Mark poses, it's, you know, where in the world has one come before the other? You know, I think the Gorbachev or Deng Xiaoping question is not. I'm not saying, you know, doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, but it does matter whether it catches mice, right? And so, you know, the efficacy is important, but it's not a, you know, look at the so-called democratic countries, right? You now have systems such as in the US and so on, where it's $1 one vote as much as one country one person one vote. So you have, it's very, very complicated system. So and just because you have democracies, it does not ensure better policy making, because the vast majority of people, when they cast their votes, are making they are making voting decisions based on all kinds of considerations, which have very little to do with improved policy making. So, you know, I mean, think about Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, okay, and why he was fired. I mean, it was just pure. It was a ridiculous proposal in the first place. You know, even a conservative economist would not have come up with that. But it was a product of the system. You know, you're where you are trying to do, for want of a better reference, the Najib Razak. You know, spend money, buy political support, and so on and so forth. And the temptation to do that is very strong in Malaysia. Besides the ethnic ethnopopulism which I referred to earlier. So, you know, but does that mean that Malaysia has never had a better policy just because we've had ethnopopulism around for ever since the 1960s? You know, when you basically got rid of more ideological politics. You know, we've never had a decent policy debates on almost anything, you know, in this country. You know, when you think about the issues, did we have a good policy debate after the Asian financial crisis? No. Did we seriously try to understand what went wrong with the global financial crisis? I'm afraid not. We have a very, very poor and you know, and unfortunately, this is reinforced by so-called market experts, right? Who basically are rewarded for being part of the echo chamber. If you are too dissident, if you're too independent thinking, you know, you basically lose clients. Nobody wants to listen to you. Nobody wants, you know, you don't have clients, and you know, the nature of warning is that you cannot be exactly sure when a problem is going to explode, and the fact that that a problem has not exploded doesn't mean that the policy was wrong. In fact, it might be precisely because the policy was correct that you do not have an explosion. Okay, so how do we recognize that? How do we reward that? This is a very difficult issue. So you know, although I was a good friend of people like David Held and so on, who wrote a book on, you know, 8 different models of democracy and so on and so forth. I don't think you know, any of the 8 models necessarily guarantee much better policy making, and that is his different models do not even consider the kinds of complications which we have in this country.
Prof, I have a question. Can you hear me, guys?
You have to speak up, Faisal.
Yeah.
Really? Okay. Does this work? Does this help?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I've got a question. I've been following your reading a bit, Prof. Following your writing a bit, Prof. On sort of like the gist of it. I feel that you don't think it's a good idea for the US to keep increasing rates because that's bad for the developing world. I'd just like to sort of like follow up on that a bit. If I got that right, which is worse for the developing world, stagflation in the US or a recession in the US?
Okay, let me unpack the question, Faisal. It's a very important question because, as you know, in my writings over a year ago, or even up to the middle of last year, I was warning about the possibility of stagflation. I'm no longer warning about stagflation. I'm now warning only about stagnation. The reason is, I think that we have basically we have an exaggerated view of the threat of stagflation. Let me elaborate that. Okay, we have a situation where undoubtedly the purported cure for inflation in the world, as promoted by the US Fed and most central bankers, is to raise interest rates. Now, you both studied some economics at some point in the past, and many in the audience have done some economics, varying degrees of economics, and you all remember that that basically we are told that the problem with inflation is when it is accelerating. Okay, inflation in and of itself can be just a one-shot phenomena, and if it's not accelerating, it's not a problem. That's why the concept of NAIRU was invented, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Okay, so that concept implies that you shouldn't get excited about the fact that prices have risen. Of course, you would prefer that prices did not rise, but it could have risen due to one-shot factors. Okay, so for example, if you cut off Russian oil, or you cut off Russian fertilizer, or you cut off something else from Russia, you are likely to affect the price. Is likely to affect the price of food, of fertilizer, of fuel. Okay, definitely that will happen. But is that going to continue? And is inflation likely to accelerate? And there is very little evidence of that. And the evidence comes from none other than from the US. So I would even argue that even for the US, what Powell is doing is not good for the US. Okay, but worse, there are many people in the US who would basically argue that it is because the US, for want of a better term, the US ruling class, Wall Street, basically takes the view that labor has become uppity. Why? Because a succession of presidents, beginning with Obama and Trump, continued this, and Biden have all ensured full employment in the U.S. since the global financial crisis, since the so-called Great Recession. So, because they ensured a full employment, workers are purportedly much more uppity now. And we had the phenomenon before about 2 years ago or 3 years ago, which was referred to as the Great Resignation, where people were quitting their jobs not because they didn't want income, but because they were getting some other income, or they could ride out the income because the income and the conditions of work were so were such that they didn't want to continue, and this was called the Great Resignation. Now, usually in the past, we think that employers think that workers are uppity when they demand higher wages and so on through their unions. But in this case, the union movement has been so weakened in the US especially that this is how individual workers, many of whom are not are on contracts for labor rather than contracts of labor, they begin to respond to their condition by reacting in a different way. So the result of this was that you had wage pressures, and this you can easily see from reading the Wall Street Journal, because in a sense, since Mr. Murdoch took over the Wall Street Journal, when Dow Jones was running the Wall Street Journal, it had greater pretensions to being, well, editorially it was always very conservative, but it had, the journalism was much more balanced. Now, when you read the Wall Street Journal, you get a sense of what the owners want. Okay, so you have a strong sense of what they want, and they basically are pretty much anti-labor. Now, this is a very US situation, and there are a few other economies in the world, such as perhaps Japan, perhaps Singapore, perhaps even Malaysia, where we have close to full employment. But in most of the world, you do not have close to full employment. You certainly don't have that in Europe. And so the cost of unemployment benefits, etc., in those countries are much, much higher. And so it is painful for all these countries. In fact, arguably, Faisal, it's more painful for countries where you have such benefits than in most developing countries where such benefits do not exist. Okay? So what happened during the pandemic is an extraordinary situation where some temporary benefits were introduced in many parts of the world, especially in middle-income countries, which were previously not there. Now we have a situation where many of those are being wound down, but you're leaving a major hole in revenue. Okay, because you basically spend a great deal of money during this period. Now, to be fair, I think macroeconomic policy should generally be counter-cyclical. Okay, not on a year-to-year basis where you're trying to balance the budget every year, but over the course of the business cycle, you want to be counter-cyclical. In boom times, you tax more, you slow down the economy a little bit. When the economy is doing badly, you stimulate the economy more. That's precisely what you do. This is a very simple. Some people would call it a Keynesian insight, but I think many people besides Keynes recognize this before the general theory was published. And I think the difference between Keynes and, say, Kalecki is that Kalecki has a view which recognizes that there are different interests in a society, and these might be referred to as classes. Okay, and this is the strength of the Kaleckian view versus, say, the simple Keynesian view, which pretends that there are no classes. But whatever the case might be, the fact is that this view has long been dominant, but it was killed basically about 4 decades ago with the Thatcherite and Reagan revolutions, or counter-revolutions, if you will. So that kind of thinking doesn't exist anymore. It's been substituted by things like the so-called what some people refer to as neoliberal economics, that previously known as partly as the Washington Consensus, and it's known by a variety of names and labels. I don't want to get into all that right now, but the fact of the matter is that now with inflation largely with inflation no longer accelerating, we now have a situation where what the Fed is doing is overkill. And it's not only adversely affecting the US economy, it's affecting the world. And it's affecting the world in different ways precisely because of the kinds of transfers, etc., available in different countries, which we just discussed. So I think it's a very dangerous situation, not only for developing countries, but you're quite right to make that observation, and there's an implied criticism there, because I spend most of my time talking about developing countries. I don't think anybody in Europe, for example, is going to listen to me, and I don't really want to bother with them, and so on and so forth. There are some very fine European economists who have been recognizing this. Peter Bofinger, for example, from Germany, has recognized many of these issues. But we need to raise the level of consciousness. Now, a decade ago, when I was doing work with in Africa hardly had any strategy on how to raise revenue. Today, I find that they are the most far-sighted, and they're pushing hardest on revenue reforms and so on and so forth, on taxation and so on. And unfortunately, we are quite smug. Latin America, there's a great deal of coordination among Latin American countries, partly common language and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, in Asia, we don't seem to learn from each other. We don't seem to learn from tax systems. And in Malaysia, we have a situation where we have not had a serious public finance economist since the late Ismail Saleh and Wee Chong Hui retired. And we really need far more. Alan knows this very well. The Bank Negara has trained many people in monetary economics of a particular type, mainly. But many people recognize the limitations of that. But as far as fiscal policy is concerned, as far as the people who are working in treasury and so on are concerned, we do not have that kind of comparable preparation. And there's so much going on. Some of the people in the what's his name, Thomas Piketty, the French rock star economist, who highlighted questions of inequality and so on. Piketty, for example, has a huge. One of his colleagues is Emmanuel Saiz, who's been talking a lot about wealth taxes and so on and so forth. And the other younger colleague, Gabriel Zuckman, has done very, very interesting comparative work. But not, in this country, we find ourselves quite oblivious. The professional organizations do not seem to encourage any discussion of this. Even the Treasury does not have an institute dedicated to fiscal policy or public finance and so on. Which almost every self-respecting country would have. And instead we are talking about very, very mimicking the conversations which are going on in the West about having fiscal boards and the so-called rules of fiscal policy and so on. And then we make so-called debt ceilings which we don't even adhere to, and we shift around. And then we have allowed this kind of huge borrowings to finance to finance government-linked companies, which do not even go through the Public Accounts Committee, which the Parliament doesn't seem to know very much about. It's not properly audited by the Auditor General. Even the Accountant General is not privy to much of the data. So we have a huge expansion of things like 1MDB, ECRL, Dana Infra, and a whole range of other things, where a lot of hanky-panky is going on, but beyond parliamentary purview. So we really have to get our act together, but unfortunately, the kind of this discussion and debate which has been going on in the country, does not lend itself to improving this kind of policy. Over to you.
I definitely agree with you, Prof. I think Malaysia is definitely missing one of the most important type of cornerstone institution when it comes to fiscal policy. Of having an independent fiscal institute, in which many other countries have. I think that would at least have some collection of expertise on public finance. That will be very helpful in actually for us to actually have a more conversation on independent conversation on public finance. I do have a very interesting data point to share in relation to your point earlier on wage pressure, wage spiral. So I think traditionally, central banker would try to convince you that you need to make unemployment rate higher in order to bring inflation down. You need to make sure that there's no wage increase and so on, that spiral. But I think what is very interesting is that they always ignore the point of profit, whether there's actually any profit inflation. So a work by University of Massachusetts recently have found out that the profit margin for US companies is now the highest it has ever been since the Second World War. Right, and instead of actually pushing up wages, companies are in fact pushing up prices and their margins. So, but to be fair, the ECB has been talking about this in their minutes about especially the German part of the camp. They have been talking a lot about the concern about inflation due to profits and so on. So we are nearing the hour mark. Maybe we should actually ask some questions. Faisal, do you want to pick some interesting questions from the audience? We have a lot actually.
Yeah, I mean, there's one from Mark Disney. In 2018, yourself, Prof, we had Tun Daim, Hassan American, Zeti, Robert Kwok produce a report on the state of Malaysia's economy. And 3 prime ministers later, are you at liberty to give us the bullet points and why it's never been discussed? The findings of the CEP, as it were, Council of Eminent Persons.
I am sorry to disappoint everybody. There is no such report. We never collaborated on producing a report. And in fact, we were given 100 days. We were not asked to prepare a report. We never prepared a report. A report was prepared by a secretariat, perhaps under the supervision of Tun Daim and so on. And that report, but that was never a report of the entire CEP. There is another report prepared by a committee of, if I remember correctly, 5 mainly lawyers on legal reforms, and that was also perhaps an interesting report. I think the late Justice Vora chaired that committee. And there is absolutely no reason why that report should not be made publicly available. I think it's completely the discretion of I'm not even sure why it is a secret in the first place. Okay, but the fact of the matter is that the CEP never prepared a report. We met with a lot of stakeholders, and we solicited a lot of views. We did not have a consensus view on most things. Some of us took initiatives to do certain things. I, for example, tried to do 2 or 3 things. One in the area of instead of abolishing the GST, I sought to have a number of reforms around the GST. One, to have an integrated tax authority rather than a segmented tax authority, with customs being separated from the customs handling GST being separated from the Internal Revenue Board. The second thing which I tried to do was to, insofar as possible, to reduce the regressive character of the GST through some specific reforms. And in fact, the head of customs at that time was very open to these reforms. But unfortunately, the minister and perhaps the prime minister, I'm not sure, never considered these reforms, to my knowledge. And so there was never any discussion. Nobody, it never went through. Yet another reform which I was very keen on was to improve health financing. This was but together with the increase in health financing, we were also recommending a number of reforms to the health system itself to ensure universal health care in line with the declared commitment of the government. Now, I was very heartened, for example, last year when Khairi Jamaluddin, whom I believe is a member of the society, announced that he wanted to increase government spending to 5% instead of the Pakatan Harapan's promised 4%. But unfortunately, of course, as we know, nothing happened. It was not reflected in the last budget of the previous finance minister of the day before the election. So, we do not see any commitment to increasing healthcare financing, but very importantly, we do not see any shift to preventive health. What do you call it? What is it called? Kesihatan Madani or whatever it's called. That actually is very interesting. It's a front page item in some newspapers today, where there's talk about a greater emphasis on preventive health, particularly as far as non-communicable diseases are concerned, and a range of other reforms, which I think are steps in the right direction. But the terms and conditions of service are very important to improve. And Malaysia actually has a commendable record, especially in the early years after independence, in terms of progress in health. But after those early years, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, much of it had to do with a very simple reform: the introduction of the Bidan Kampung. The introduction of the Bidan Kampung reduced maternal mortality, reduced child mortality. Remember that in 1960, almost 90%, 91%, if I'm not mistaken, of the population of the Federation of Malaya at that time was in the countryside. Was considered rural. Today, of course, the country has changed. We have the country is about 80% urban, if not more, because many people live in designated rural areas, but they're actually part of the urban economy. Ulu Langat and so on and so forth. So I think those reforms have run out of steam, but we need reforms for today. And the role of the Bidan Kampung should be extended to cover matters of nutrition, for example, because many of our problems in health are inflicted by our bad behavior as far as food consumption is concerned. So, so these reforms are not simple and straightforward, but they're not necessarily going to be terribly costly. But certainly there is a strong case to be made for increased financing on the health front. So these were the two things. The third thing, of course, was on nutrition, where we tried to introduce a universal school feeding program. All children would have, and this was introduced in Japan a century ago, when Japan was poorer than Malaysia is today. Every child had guaranteed school a meal in school. And that took care of the nutritional needs. And this is why Japan has the highest longevity in the world today. So little reforms like that can go a very, very long way. But unfortunately, all three proposals never got anywhere. But I would not say that there was any reform. So I'm sorry to disappoint Mark and others who have been talking about this mythical report of the CEP. There is no such report. Yeah.
Prof, I just want to follow on with that. I mean, you've had a bit of a history with the establishment. I think it's fair to say that. I mean, you were, as you put it in your NT speech, at one point public enemy number one. You campaigned very hard against crony capitalists, and I think you were sued for 250 million ringgit at one point. And yet, through the CEP, you ended up working with the very people you criticized. And I think given the political landscape today, you were a bit of a pioneer in that regard. We're just curious, how did your appointment to the CEP happen? Were you surprised to be appointed? What went through your mind at that point?
Well, given the composition of the Pakatan Harapan government at that time, I had long advocated something which was pre-existed Pakatan Harapan, namely Pakatan Rakyat, which involved PAS as well. And there was a time when PAS was talking about, a welfare society, a welfare system and so on. So, this was a different time, and certainly I had been associated with many of these things. Much of my work and some of the research which we conducted on wealth accumulation as well as on corruption dates back to that period. But I was always quite transparent about it. I didn't use it against, with basically not only without fear, but there was no favor either. I mean, I didn't, so for example, when I disagreed with the current prime minister on the response to the Asian financial crisis, it was quite clear. But neither did I agree with Tun Mahathir's actions, and particularly his action against the current prime minister. So I was neither fish nor fowl, if you want to put it that way, and so nobody could accuse me of taking sides in that thing, and perhaps that's why I was a kind of a safe bet, but the fact of the matter is, despite being in the CEP, I really had no influence. Okay, and I wish that I had more influence, not because of projecting my own ego or anything like that, but these are things I've been thinking about for my entire adult life, and I would like to think that one can make a difference, that public policy can be improved, and so on and so forth. And otherwise, there's no raison d'être, right? What do you live for, right? I mean, what does one live for? So I would like to see a better world. I would like to see a better Malaysia, and I think it can be done. I've enjoyed, I was an only child, but at the same time, I never felt alone, because, partly because I went to a boarding school for many years, and I always, so I've had very strong ties and with a range of people, and do not feel, in a sense, it's quite a difficult thing, I think, to on the one hand not feel not drawn into much of the ethno-populist discourses, and there are several of them, as you know, but at the same time understanding why people are drawn to all that, and I mean, I was quite close, for example, to African Americans when I first went abroad to study as a student. When in the United States, and that was, it enriched me in many ways. I was very close to Latin American and African students as well, and all those connections enriched me in very deep and profound and enduring ways. So I do not feel, I feel on the one hand quite patriotic, but at the same time, it does not diminish my internationalism, or perhaps I should put it conversely, my internationalism does not diminish my patriotism.
Thanks for that.
Maybe is it, yeah, I thought it would be a good time to ask, given that, for our younger listeners who are tuning in, what advice would you give them, who are interested in pursuing a career in economics or public policy, given what you have shared?
My daughter was a pre-medical student, and she gave it all up to do economics, and I discouraged her from doing so. So I generally, I must admit that I studied economics at a very good time. When people were interested, like Keynes, man of affairs. They were trying to grapple with the issues of the day. And so, the people, the strongest influences I had were people like Robert Triffin, who talked about the international monetary system and how it was basically a non-system, after Bretton Woods ended, and Albert Hirschman was another. But these are not exactly the kinds of economists which you find in most textbooks. These are people who really were very, very, who were very much people of the times. I mean, Hirschman, for example, was part of the resistance to the Nazis, to the fascists in Italy. And so these were I was very privileged in that sense, to study with them. One of the things I did before I went to university, I had to leave school early, so I read this thick book of about 2,000 pages called Asian Drama, 3 volumes, and by Gunnar Myrdal, But Gunnar Myrdal was again another economist who was not interested in whether his theories were correct or not. He was trying to understand the world in order to change it, for the better. So those were the economists who inspired me. But today, unfortunately, I once had a dinner with the director of the LSE who was complaining to me that, that the younger staff of the LSE in the economics department especially, were not interested in these kinds of issues. They wanted to, they were more concerned about the mathematical sophistication of their particular modeling and so on. So, I cannot say with great degree of conviction and honesty that I would encourage anybody to do economics. It doesn't mean that economics doesn't need to be done. We certainly do need it, but I would only encourage those who are able to have a sense of purpose, a strong sense of direction, to engage in economics, because economics has become so heavily ideological. I mean, take for example something like the 2% inflation target. Okay, it's a mantra we repeated all over the world, But how did it come about? As my colleague and I have pointed out, it just came about because the Minister of Finance of New Zealand thought it was a great idea to have a slogan, 2 by 92. Because this was he came up with the slogan in '89, and he told the governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand to go for 2%. 2 by 92 was a great slogan as far as he was concerned. And now, Jerome Powell and everybody else piously talks about it as if it's some kind of, God-given law. I mean, this is the way, myths are created, and so people often think of economics as a science, but I don't see anything terribly scientific about that. And the story goes on, and when it doesn't suit them, people often don't point out. I mean, as you know, Milton Friedman, who's a very conservative, and Ben Bernanke both pointed out that the U.S. Fed intervention to deal with price inflation basically resulted in worsening the Great Depression in the case of Friedman, and in the case of and postponing recovery in 1937, and in the case of Bernanke, exacerbated what happened after the oil price hikes of the 1970s. So these are manufactured recessions, manufactured stagnation. These are not some things which would have come about, but it comes about due to the single-minded obsession with suppressing consumer price inflation. They don't get worried when the asset prices are going through the roof. They're all cheering all the way to the bank when asset prices are going to the roof. I mean, basically, QE was sending asset prices all over the place, as you yourselves have pointed out. But did they do anything about it? No. But only when consumer prices went up, and consumer prices went up, why? Because of the pandemic, and then because of the war. It had nothing to do with other factors. I mean, I don't want to say nothing to do, but those are the two main drivers of the inflation in the recent period. Both supply side disruptions, pandemic disruptions, as well as war disruptions. So I think we are in very dangerous territory when we leave it to the people who supposedly know, who are driven by ideological and other kinds of considerations, and they are doing great damage to the world today. I mean, we are not going to see any significant progress towards not only towards the sustainable development goals, but even, for example, we are now going to see an acceleration of global heating because of the, Europe is now re-embracing coal, because they don't want to be dependent on Russian oil and gas. I mean, re-embracing coal, and we're not even talking about Trump's clean coal. We're talking about coal with all the sulfides and sulfates in them, which used to cause yellow rain in this part of the world and causes a whole range of problems, and continues to do so in this part of the world, because in Malaysia, all the licenses which were issued to the generators, the IPPs, they were issued on the basis that they would be generating electricity with diesel. Now they're using even cheaper fuel, coal, and they're not even using clean coal. So all the people around them are basically heavily exposed to the sulfides and sulfates and other toxic elements in the coal. And we don't pay enough attention to many of these problems. We go for the fashionable stuff, the stuff which is in the headlines, orangutan or climate change. We should be doing something about that, But what about people who are exposed to toxic waste? I mean, the only time we know that our vegetables have excessive toxic pesticides in the vegetables is when the vegetables are rejected by neighboring countries. I mean, don't we care whether Malaysians are eating toxic vegetables? So this is, I think it's very fundamental, that the quality of policy making and it has to improve, and this can only be involved through popular democratic control, not simply by voting once in 5 years, and then after that giving up all your rights to any policy determination, and so on. So I think we have a huge agenda, and that's why I really appreciate this kind of opportunity. But we need to translate this into a language which our parents, our grandparents can understand. Well, not my parents, but your parents.
Prof, if we could, so there are a couple of questions from the audience. I think they're somewhat related, at least in my mind. One is from Iqbal Majid. Is Malaysia's domestic growth wage-led or profit-led? And what policies can we implement to be a wage-led coordinated economy? And the second one comes from a Stephen Feng. What's going to happen with our EPF, with so many people with very little left for their retirement?
With EPF, I honestly don't know. It's become a political football. The UMNO leadership and others have basically been pushing very hard for some years now to allow people to take out as much money as possible. So I fear that old people will have very little choice but to continue to work as long as they can, and which may not necessarily be a bad thing for us to have a longer working life. But considering the poor health in which many of us feel are in, I really am very concerned. The number of people, my friend, the late Khalid Kadir, was president of the Diabetes Association, and Khalid basically once said to me that he was losing. He was fighting a losing battle against diabetes because the cases of diabetes was just going up and up and up, and it was due to all kinds of government policies. People taking lots of unnecessarily taking sugar. I mean, for example, there are drinks in this country which are banned in other countries because they contain so much sugar. Okay, I don't want to be sued. I managed to get out of that 250 million suit with Vincent Tan, but I don't want to take unnecessary risks. I've got better things to do with my
Does the
life.
drink start with the letter M, Prof?
Sorry?
Does the drink start with the letter M?
Yeah, right. In fact, it sounds like my country, the low point in the country. Anyway, the fact of the matter is that we have had this NCD problem for years, and nothing has been done about it. My former colleague Nazeha, she pointed out, that the that a lot of people have even more years of their life in poor health towards the end of their lives. And the number of people who are now relying on dialysis, people who are in who have to resort to dialysis, people who are taking insulin, and so on and so forth. Type 2 diabetes is rife, and so on and so forth. So we have a whole range of arguably self-inflicted problems, but there is a major role for government health. And my concern about the recent announcement is that you can't leave it to private medical doctors to solve this problem. Public health and preventive health especially, there is a preventive element which involves deterrence. Okay, and you can't expect private practitioners, medical practitioners, to have a strong interest in deterrence. Okay, so there is a huge role for the public sector. This is recognized throughout the world, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We should learn. I mean, many of the so-called purported best practices are not best practices, but when there are best practices which are recognized throughout the world, which unfortunately we don't take on. Now, so going back to the first question of wage-led or profit-led, let's face it. I mean, the labor movement has never been strong in this country. Okay, at one point during the 1940s, 1/3 of the labor force was organized. It was crushed after that with the declaration of the emergency, and after that, a rump of a labor movement, union movement, was created, and it has always been relatively weak. And unfortunately, it has not only been weak; it has become weaker over the years. So, for example, 3 or 4 decades ago, about 12% of employees in this country were unionized. Today, I think only about 6% are unionized. And of that 6% who are unionized, the majority are actually in public services. So less than 3% are actually in a position to take industrial actions, because many people in the public sector do not have the option of taking industrial action. So there is no likelihood that you're going to have a wage-led economy. This is not an economy in any sense comparable to what you have in Germany or Northern Europe and so on and so forth. And some of my friends would like that to happen. But rather than having that happen, I think it is useful to do to basically through statute, through law, to push up wages. And and we have a situation of close to full employment, but the Achilles heel in that is that we have possibly a third of our labor force, a third of our real labor force is actually foreign, and a quarter of our labor force is undocumented. Okay, so they have almost zero rights under the law, the undocumented ones. The foreign ones have reduced rights compared to Malaysian workers. So we Malaysian workers also have not come to terms with them. So it's a very complex thing. Alan and others have done work to try to address these kinds of questions, but there are no simple answers. But we have essentially to answer the first question, a situation where we have a profit-driven, and it's a I mean, we had the last finance minister telling us that nothing wrong with even when profits are due to windfall profits, great, keep them. The government is not going to tax you. Now I think this must be one of the few countries in the world where you allow sustained windfall profits. Now, at this stage, of course, after what has happened with the gloves industry and so on and so forth, this is no longer an opportune time. But when you had those windfall profits, something should have been done. We have an enduring fiscal deficit, which finance minister after finance minister feels obliged to perpetuate. This is very different from the situation when the prime minister stepped down as finance minister, or rather was fired as finance minister in 1998. He had basically balanced the budget more than any previous finance minister for a pretty long period of time. I'm not suggesting that what he did was good. In fact, as I say, you need to do it you need to always be counter-cyclical in your budgetary policy, as in macroeconomic policy generally. But to be fair to him, at that time the economy was booming. We had 8% growth for almost a decade before 98. So I can appreciate what he was doing then, but in the period since then, we have continued to run budget deficits like nobody's business, and we keep on raising the limit, the debt limits, and worst of all, we hide from Parliament and we hide from the Malaysian people all the borrowing, which is called government guaranteed borrowing, which goes to support the government-linked companies.
All right, Prof, we have reached the 1.5 hour mark, so thinking of wrapping the session up, is there anything that you will want to tell the audience or share with the audience? Any last message that you want to highlight?
I think it's very important for all of us, including myself, and I urge both of you before this meeting to be very to be tough with me, and you have actually been very too kind with me. Faisal basically his toughest researcher after me, his 2-year-old kid. But seriously, I think what we really need is robust discourse. Not malicious conversations. We really need a much more robust discourse, and we really need to think differently. That's why and we need to draw lessons from throughout the world. And my disappointment with Kwasi Kwarteng is not the ridiculous budget he came up with, but the fact that he should have known better, because he is an economic historian, and he presumably has read quite a bit, and I suspect he has. But the exigencies of the demands of holding that position are such that you do this kind of opportunistic nonsense, which cost him his job. But I think we need to have this kind of these kind of critical discussions, and that's why I greatly appreciate your efforts to promote that. But this needs to be done on an ongoing basis, not once in 3 years or whenever was the last time Oxbridge Society, we talked about this, and this needs to be done not only with me, but with a whole range of people, and we need to have much more robust debates, and we also need to learn much more. We need to be humble and be willing to learn, and to learn not only from successes but also to learn from mistakes. Because how do we avert future mistakes if we don't learn from mistakes? So these are some of the challenges which we have, and I really appreciate this. And Sean, I really appreciate your backup for the whole session, and this is very much. But I really commend your effort, and I do hope that this session has been of use to people who have tuned in, and I hope that you continue to encourage much more debate for the betterment of our society and our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
On that note, thank you everyone. Thank you, Prof. Jomo. Thank you, Alan, for putting this together. Thank you, Faisal, for asking a lot of interesting questions. And we'll take that point and we will try to organize more robust sessions in the future with other speakers. And thank you everyone for tuning in, and good night, and see you next time.
Thanks, Prof.
Thank you.
Thank you.